So China is being impacted. They've, going into this crisis, they were having, for example, spiking coal prices. That's a big problem for them because they get a lot of their power from coal, and so that's been an issue. In addition to obviously the oil and gas prices are a problem for them. Now they had a less acute gas issue than Europe, but Asia has been impacted by higher gas prices as well. In the longer run, one thing that looks like China's doing is that so a lot of these Western companies were forced or pretty much had to divest their Russian assets, really at pennies on the dollar, kind of just mark them down, get out of those positions. And so China has already stated a willingness, an interest in potentially coming up and scooping up some of these Russian energy commodity assets. And so that kind of continues the Belt and Road trend that China's been doing, where instead of reinvesting their dollar trade surpluses into treasuries, they've been investing them into making loans to developing countries that generally give them access to commodities or infrastructure. And so it seems like this kind of gives them an upper hand in terms of getting, kind of bargain priced energy and commodities. So I think over time, Russia will probably be able to access a number of markets that they don't really have the ability to select where they get their commodities from. So maybe we can look at, countries like India, countries like Brazil. We'll see over time, the longer this drags out. I think Russia will probably be able to find buyers for its commodities. But during this period where they need capital and many of their assets are selling very cheaply, that does give China a window to come in and get a lot of those assets. That's why the extent of this conflict was somewhat surprising to me. I mean, I don't think a lot of people would have been surprised by some activity around eastern Ukraine, around some of those borders. But the extent of this attack surprised me and surprised many, because as you point out, there's almost no winners from this, right? So Russians are, the vast majority of Russians are not benefiting. Many of them have gone over and fought and died. Ukrainians obviously are not benefiting. Russian oligarchs aren't benefiting. It's hard to see who is benefiting from this. I think, if this drags out, China could be a beneficiary. Potentially, for the reasons we discussed, that it kind of gives them a little bit more influence over Russia, because they're saying, basically Russia now has fewer options, and so it might be good for China. It's hard to say for sure. It also gave China kind of intel on what would happen if you tried to invade an area. It kind of gives China a playbook of, okay, we need to avoid this problem, we need to avoid this problem. So I think they might be a beneficiary. But overall, there are people that focus on geopolitics and cultural histories, obviously a lot more than me. So for me, it looks irrational, but it doesn't look like there's any winners to me, really.
And what about Ukraine? Does it still have any type of functioning economy?
Well, the economy is so partly what we're seeing is that Russia is seizing some of their their shipping assets and things like that. And so part of why wheat, for example, is so expensive is that Russia is a big wheat exporter, but so is Ukraine. And so to the extent that Russia is able to control large portions of Ukraine, I think what we're seeing is that we're kind of missing a harvest season, we're missing a planting season over there, and so that's going to affect global wheat prices and global just agricultural in general, and then. Obviously it's hard to function even in an inflationary economy, let alone a war economy. It's very hard to have a functioning economy. You have well over 1 million refugees spreading into the rest of Europe. And so it is hard to call that a functioning economy at this current time. And so that's obviously impacting a lot of that region. But then specifically, it contributes to the commodity shortfalls that we see worldwide. Basically, so along with soybeans and rice, wheat is a huge staple for human consumption. Now we can talk about the health of eating a lot of wheat, for example,
Yeah.
but it is a huge source of calories for people around the world, and it's in almost everything. It's in all sorts of it's not just bread and pasta. It's an input to all sorts of kind of processed foods, all sorts of staples that they eat around the world, and so. For example, Egypt gets a lot of its wheat imports from Ukraine and Russia, right? So now they have I think they put out basically a restriction on exporting some of their food staples, because now every country in the world has to reassess its food security and say, okay, are we getting enough And because that's when you have like revolutions, like when you have food prices go up, that's how you get revolutions. When people can't put food on the table, that's when they just go out in the street and protest and even are willing to get violent because they kind of have nothing else to lose at that point. And so pretty much the number one kind of priority of any government in the world is making sure that people are fed and that there's no food insecurity problems, at least if it's possible. And so spiking wheat prices, in addition to being highly inflationary in general, it's also like a big barometer for usually social upheaval, especially in some of the more vulnerable countries out there.
And are we seeing any anecdotal evidence of that?
Well, I mean, this is all happening in a number of weeks, right? So it takes time for these shortages to kick in besides just price going up. But the longer this goes, you'll see higher and higher food prices. You know, I think the cleanest example is the Arab Spring a decade ago, right? When, you know, that was correlated, and many would argue caused or partially caused by you had a big that's when you had kind of the last spike in foodstuffs, right? So you already had simmering tensions, and it's often the case that the spike in food price is like the final nail in the coffin, where they say, okay, now we're going into the streets, right? Now we're going to protest, and so we're not Kazakhstan had issues like that with energy not that long ago, right? That's what was a big contributor to what sparked their protests. And so this whole kind of wheat shortage or wheat price spikes are just kind of kicking in now. But essentially, the longer they go, as we go out more weeks and more months, that could trigger protests, revolutions around the world, as well as just suffering for, even if there's no major social upheaval in certain countries, just the poorest people have trouble affording food. Yeah, so to your prior question, so there are different types of oil. We often think of it as just oil, but there's actually multiple types of oil, and there are refineries that are designed to work with certain types of oil. So you can have funny situations where you have to both import and export, right? So you might have to import a certain type of oil, and even if you produce oil domestically, it might not be the same type as your own refineries are geared towards. So as we talked about, this infrastructure takes years to build, and it's kind of designed with pretty long life cycles, decades. And so that's not something that just turns overnight. And so the United States, for example, is designed to refine, we have a lot of refineries, for example, that work with Middle Eastern oil, as an example. And so, again, there are like petrochemical engineers that can go into way more detail about that whole thing and what our exact percentages are. But it's important to be aware of that. Even in something that should be, you would conceptualize it as simple, like energy processing, it's just as complex as the global supply chains. It's like if one little piece is messed up, these things that you don't even think of start to break down. And so in addition to how complex our global supply chains are, like we talked about, even getting parts to service an airline, right? So basically how complex that all is, all the semiconductors, all the commodities, all of the little components that go into all these designs. In addition, there are commodity issues. And so another example is that fertilizers. So natural gas is a key input into fertilizer. Russia has a lot of the raw materials that go into fertilizers. And so that can also impact not just wheat prices, but agricultural prices across the board. And so that's part of why this situation is so extreme, is because there are very specific things that can cause massive shortages and massive suffering if you're without them.